So, the Cutting Through Chaos Forum is going to be a platform which is, think of this as a support center. Think of it as a support group or a resource center where founders can, of course, learn from each other, share experiences with each other, share whatever their learnings, etc., are, tools, techniques, and everything that they have been able to do to cope up with the current crisis at hand at a personal level and at a business level as well. Look, I mean, the current situation as it is going to impact people in different ways. It is, of course, going to impact businesses. Some businesses will be impacted significantly. For some businesses, it will be a temporary blip that they might be able to get through. And actually, for some businesses, this corona crisis will represent an opportunity that will accelerate the adoption of uh, some of the concepts that may otherwise have taken a little longer to do. And therefore, in the next few weeks, about 7 or 8 webinars that have been scheduled will all be taking up specific issues that founders need to understand how to deal with. For example, in a lot of forums, people have spoken about extending the runway and saying that you need to have firepower for at least about 12 to 15 or 18 months. How do you do that? How do you optimize your cost? If you have to let go of people or if you have to rearrange salaries, what are the different ways in which you can do it in a manner that is appropriate to do? How do you handle different challenges? If you are not able to deliver onto contracts, what are the ways in which that situation can be handled? Now, this is not an industry specific or a company specific situation. This is a global situation. And I think, therefore, there is going to be perhaps a larger understanding or a more collaborative approach that people will have in dealing with these circumstances. And to set the context for the next few webinars that are going to come in, we have none other than Arjun Malhotra, who co-founded HCL several decades ago, and over the period of several decades has seen a few ups and downs in businesses, including some of the major downturns that happened. And as somebody who has led companies through these downturns and has experienced what it takes to be a leader in these things, in these circumstances, we are requesting Arjun to share his perspectives on this current situation, how this is different from some of the past ones, and what impact do companies or should companies expect from something like this, and what are the ways in which for companies and as individual founders and business leaders to cope up with. So with that, Arjun, if I may request you to share your perspectives on this entire thing, and then we can get into a few question and answers there, perhaps.
Good. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to add a little to that introduction. We started HCL way back in 1975-76. So I have some 40 plus years of experience in the computer industry, both hardware and IT services. So let me talk about, I won't talk about the early days because most of our problems at that time were government related, licensing related, which probably have no relevance to what you all are facing today. So let me talk about the first real recession that I had was in 1990, 91. If you remember, that's, those of you, I don't know how many of you were around, but that's the time VP Singh was our prime minister in India, and people were, I think Rajiv Goswami, I forget the name, sort of was on the cover of India Today. He had tried to self-immolate. There were lots of problems. Basically, I had just gone to the US in end of 1989 to start HCL America. Now, India in those days, foreign exchange was in great shortage. And technically, while HCL was doing quite well, HCL America, which has now become HCL Technologies, was just a startup with very limited funding because while we had the money in India, we just couldn't take it abroad and convert it to dollars. So we were doing quite well at that time. We were in a specialist field. We were doing multiprocessor extensions to Unix machines. We were sort of unique in that, other than big companies like Pyramid and MIPS that were charging $1 million per CPU, whereas ours, I mean, our CPU, multiprocessor CPU, was about $100,000 or so. But most of the work we were doing were with companies like HP and with the database folks and the uh, compiler people adding extensions to handle multiprocessor machines to their software. The recession hit. I had limited money, so I decided, and I think biggest mistake, I decided to at that time try and stop all expansion, try and just hold my resources and bide my time. Mistake, because Unix was a growing business, and through the recession, the Unix business actually grew. And so we lost a year or two because of that decision, because we had decided not to expand. Whereas if we had done the expansion during that recession, we would have done really, really well, because our growth would have been a lot faster, since not too many other companies were going to be competing with us at that time. So I just wanted to mention that that was what happened to HCL America, of what you now know as HCL Technologies, in the 1991 timeframe. It did cost us a couple of years in growth, and in hindsight, it was a mistake. But I had no idea. I was too new in the US, and that's the excuse I use to myself, that Unix was going to be a growing market and that everyone was going to move from the so-called non-Unix machines to Unix machines. So that was my first experience with the slowdown. The second one was after I left HCL, and we just started a company called TechSpan with funding from Goldman Sachs and a number of other people. Again, to work in IT services, but try and work in focused vertical domains. We started on 1st of January 1999, and within a month or less than a month, we sort of realized that our business plan was a piece of paper. The market was asking for e-commerce, and that's what we decided to focus on. Now, again, I don't know how many of you remember those days, but the thinking was that e-commerce is going to kill brick and mortar immediately. And everyone, every company, every corporate was going towards e-commerce, right? Again, during that growth, we took some, in hindsight, wrong decisions. We had large corporate customers like AT&T and Bloomingdale's, where our margins were lower than working with startups and newer companies. And so we decided, because we had limited resources in terms of people, that we'll give up the business with these traditional large customers because our margins were lower, and focus on the higher margin new company business that was happening. The reason we survived was we didn't go public, fortunately. At that time, if you were making profits, you were considered not investing enough in the future, and you were discounted. And I thought that sort of went against my grain, that, hey, how can I go public when I'm making a loss? I mean, how can I get a better valuation when I'm making a loss compared to when I'm making a profit? Sort of traditional thinking. But basically, we didn't go public, and that's why we survived, because the bubble burst at the end of 2000. And we was fortunately had $1 million in our account when the bubble burst, and we had to pick up the threads. We had grown from, in 2 years, we had grown to 70 million in revenue, and overnight we crashed down to about 25 million. And so you can imagine what that did to the company. Now, unfortunately, I didn't react quickly enough. My father wasn't well, so I was spending a lot of time in India. He passed away in August, early August, and that's when I had a little more time to go back and look at our business in the US and take some decisions. What we did do immediately was, a lot of our people who had come from India, we sent them back to India. We said, you can't be sitting on the bench in the US, but we'll support your salaries in India. So a lot of them moved back to India. That itself wasn't enough. So the other thing we did was, I remember having an executive team meet in a room and decide what to do. And everyone, obviously, the simple answer was, we've got to do layoffs. So my first question to them was, then who in this room do we lay off first before we go down the line? And of course, that created a lot of upheaval. And so everyone then decided that they would take a 10% salary cut, and then we would see how things move along. So, excuse me. No, in fact, they took a 20% salary cut. And then we said, we'll see how things move along. Things didn't improve. And so we ended up having another executive meeting where the executive team took another 10% salary cut. And we said the rest of the company has to take a 10% cut too, except that in the US, we said that we cannot have anyone, at least in the Bay Area, have a salary of less than $50,000 annually. And so I remember my admin, Kathy Chadsey, had a salary of $52,000. So we just cut $2,000 in her salary so that she at least got the minimum 50,000. But that's the decision we took. We had an extra person in accounting, and so we talked to them, and they took a decision on their own, said that they would work, all of them would work 1 day less in the week, on paper at least, not that they worked 1 day less, but that then allowed the company to save that kind of uh, cash in terms of meeting the objective. What we also, sometime after August, when I went back to the US, I sort of realized that, look, in our business, you can't just do nothing. While we had kept ourselves cash neutral every month, except the 9/11 month when we had a problem with our customers in New York, we were not, we were not draining cash, but we weren't generating cash. So basically, you can't survive that way. In the IT services industry, at least, you're sort of slipping down a hill, and whether you realize it or not, you're gaining momentum going downwards, and at some stage you'll find it very difficult to stop. So we decided on two things. We decided on a strategy which we called asset light, and I'll give you a little background. uh, since I'd come out of HCL and I'd seen a number of these large IT services companies and I knew their strategy, we figured that where they were losing out, they were doing more commodity work, if I use that term. We wanted to do more consulting type specialized work with a higher bill rate. And so we said we are domain experts, whatever that means, in terms of the work that we do for you. So when the slowdown happened, we had a meeting and everyone decided that we'll focus on the financial market. And we put together a strategy called Asset Light. Now, Asset Light it's a fairly simple strategy. Everyone was laying off at that time, whether you were Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan Chase, you were all laying off people. And all these people were in New York, and the best way to meet them was to go to a bar and have a drink and talk to people, and you'd find out who's laid off from where, what expertise they had, et cetera, et cetera. And in that, we'd find out that Morgan Stanley had a requirement in the municipal bond, the muni bonds business, and they wanted someone who understood muni bonds. And Aki Kamdar, who was my person in New York, remembered meeting someone from Goldman Sachs who had been laid off on the muni bonds area. And so we go talk to him and say, why don't you come for this interview? And if we get the business, we'll give you a job. If we don't get the business, it doesn't really matter. You don't lose anything, we don't lose anything. And that's really how we built the business during that time. This asset light worked really well for us because a couple of years later, the business came back and all the people who we had helped, even those who did not get jobs, but they were thankful that we had helped, they all got recruited because it's a very incestuous business, that whole capital markets. And they all got us in and said, how can we help? And our business really boomed. And we sort of became Headstrong, and that was the company name at that time. And we became specialists, specialists in that capital markets investment banking business. The other thing we did was, there was a company in India called WebTech. Now, WebTech was basically the back office for a European investment bank called DKRW, which and DKRW was run by the CIO. There was a gentleman called Alnur Ramji, who, when I last knew of him, he was the CIO of British Telecom some years ago. Now, Alnur Ramji wanted to teach these people the innards of the investment bank and have them in India. He recruited guys only from the IITs. When we were paying 4 lakhs for fresh engineers from the IIT, he was paying 7 lakhs. But he insisted that their JEE rank had to be less than 300. So he really went for the cream, in his view. And he taught them the innards of the investment bank. Now, DRKW got acquired by Oh, they got acquired by a bank. I forget the bank now, but the bank then got acquired by Allianz. And when the slowdown happened, Allianz decided that they were going to. And sorry, now I'm talking about the slowdown in 2000. 2000. No, sorry, I'm still at 2001. So when Allianz decided in their wisdom that they would become Eurocentric and close everything in Asia, and so they were laying off these people at WebTech. Now, everyone, Wipro, every company wanted that expertise, but all of them had a condition that they wanted Allianz to give them an order of business for 3 years or 5 years before they took over the back office. That obviously Allianz didn't want to do at that time and weren't willing to commit. So what we did was we went in and decided to take over, do a soft acquisition. By that, what I meant was we took over the lease, we took over all the equipment, and we gave everyone an appointment letter. Now, we estimated that that would cost us about $500,000. That's half our cash before we could turn them around. But we felt that if we could show domain uh, expertise in India, that was better than any other company, whether it was TCS or Wipro or even Accenture in India, we would have a leg up with our customers. And that worked really well because I remember we got an order from Bank of America for $18 million over 3 years, and they gave us the development and they gave Accenture the QA. And I remember Accenture went to them and said that, why don't you, we'll post one of our experts in India, why don't you let us do the development? And Bank of America's answer was very simple. They said, if you post a person from here to India, your cost will be so high that you won't make any money. And so it may not be of interest to you to do your best. We'd rather go with Headstrong, who have that expertise already in India at much more manageable salary levels than posting expats there. So that was the other thing that worked for us. And it's sometimes you think it's opportunistic, and yes, I always say that whatever business you're running, you've got to, how should I say, you've got to play the game with the cards you have in hand. You can't keep sitting back and saying, I wish I had better cards, or I wish I had a joker, or I wish I had aces, or whatever. Those are the cards you have. That's what you got to play with. You got to look at opportunities that come and decide whether they fit in with your strategic requirement or not. Right. The other slowdown that happened to us was way back in 2007, 2008. If you remember that big mortgage crisis. Now, remember Headstrong, we were growing, we were doing really well. We used to proudly say that the top 20 banks on Wall Street are our accounts. And why do I need more accounts? I mean, I don't need to service anyone else. What happened is when that slowdown happened, there weren't 20 companies anymore. Some of them got acquired. Some big ones like Merrill Lynch also got acquired by Bank of America. And so suddenly our market completely shrank and everyone was laying off, especially on the big banks. And so we had to take fairly drastic steps. So again, we sat down and decided the top management would take a 10% cut. At that time, our VPs and our principals, and that was the way the organization was structured, also volunteered actually, which was really, really nice of them, to come in and take a cut, 10% cut with us. And we said that what we will do is at the end of the year, we will obviously do cost control and do all the usual stuff that people do. At the end of the year, if we make our profit, we will give back to everyone what we had cut from them in terms of their salaries. Again, that worked really well for us because two things happened. All these people who got laid off from these big companies, the mid-sized companies decided that they had ambitions, but they didn't know how to get to where they wanted to go. So they felt that this guy who's worked so many years with Goldman Sachs is going to be able to tell us where to go. So they recruited those people and said, hey, we need your help. Tell us where to go. And they obviously, a lot of it is technology dependent. And so they felt that, look, you need to develop a lot more applications and develop them quickly. And so who did they know? But they knew us. So they called us in and we ended up doing a lot of work for these mid-sized companies. In fact, the first year of the slowdown, from zero, our business in mid-sized companies went to 19%. In the second year, it went to 41%. So just to tell you how that market changed at that time. But the good news for our people was at the end of the year, our revenues were down 5%, but our profit was up, our EBITDA was up 15%. And so everyone got their salaries back, everyone got their bonuses back, and things went on. And that really is what the other interesting thing we did was Morgan Stanley was our largest account. We were about 25 million with them at that time out of our revenue of, I forget now, it was 66 million or something, but maybe it was 80 million, but 25 million was Morgan Stanley. And Morgan Stanley came to us and said, we need a 10% cut, and we're obviously going to lay off 10% of the consultants you have because we're laying off 10% of our people. Our competitors in Morgan Stanley were Capgemini and TCS. And so we decided again on a strategy. We said they have to report quarterly results. We are a private company. We talked to our investors and said, look, I want to grab business from them during this time. I want to eat into their share in Morgan Stanley. So what we want to do is tell Morgan Stanley, we know you're hurting today. Why 10%? I'll give you 20% discount in the first year. We know things will get okay over time. I'll give you a 3-year plan. You give me a 3-year order for 75 million. So at least my revenue is assured. I'll give you 20% off in the first year, 10% off in the second year. And I plan to go public in the third year. And so I'll come back to my original price list in the third year. Morgan Stanley really loved it. They said, hey, you're really sort of helping us in our pain year. So I'll give you that order for 75 million. But they wanted us to take a 5% cut in the third year too, in which we agreed to. And basically, when I went to sign the order with I think their number 3 person, he asked me, what do you think your business will be from this order? And I said, I expect the 75 million to go to 125 million over 3 years. He said, yeah, I think you're being pessimistic. I think it'll be a lot more than that because a lot of my people will want to take that 20% and switch to you in the first year, and then they'll continue with you a year later. And actually what happened is from 25 million, we grew to 66 million in the second year and to 96 million in the third year. So basically that business got us something like a double or nearly more than double the 75 million that we had put together. So you've got to think a little bit out of the box. You've got to think of how to get market share from your competitors. You've got to think of what you've got to do that's different. Oh, yes, and we did talk to our investors and we did tell them that we do forward cover on the foreign exchange for 50% of that 75 million, so that even if the dollar got weaker, stronger, whatever, we are somewhat assured that our bottom line wouldn't change too much. So, you take some precautions when you take these risks, and you work with your investors, and most of them are they're fairly good. They understand too, and a lot of them have come out of some business or the other, and so they're just not MBAs from Harvard. Let me put it that way. And so it's a good idea to listen to them sometimes and think of what they have. This particular slowdown is a little different. Actually, it's very different because you don't know when the light is going to come at the end of the tunnel. Is it going to be 2 months? Is it going to be 3 months? Is it going to be 6 months? But definitely sometime by the fall, you will have a vaccine, there will be antibodies, and things will start getting back to normal. So I've just, I'm advising 2 companies right now. Both of them are in a good space. One of them is in digital online education. The other one is in telemedicine and healthcare. The telemedicine company is grappling with how to grow fast enough because they're getting too much business, which is a really nice problem to have. The digital company has got 2 sides to it. One side is growing and one side is getting threatened. And for growth, we got to find people. Where we're getting threatened, we got to see what we do with our extra people. But it's interesting what's happening there. We are making plans for 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months, and saying that, hey, let's do a 3-month plan today. The minute we think it's going to go to 6 months, we'll implement plan 2, and then 4 months, 5 months later, when we think it's going to 9 months, we'll implement plan 3. But all of them have to be tight cost control. In fact, you're all startups, so this may not apply. But when we did our cost control at Headstrong, we were, as I said, over $50 million. We moved our sanctioning authority one level up. So if you could sanction travel for your person under you, now your boss would have to sanction it or any expense. And that sort of helped. We cut down all our variable expenses, made them, you had to get sanctioned from a pretty high point, stopped all recruiting clearances had to come from the CEO, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't have to describe the steps, those are all documented, you all know about them, you probably have read about them. But those are things you have to do, don't not do them. This is also a great time to get people to get motivated to be part of your company because there's unlikely that they'll get jobs outside except in a very few sectors. And so this is the time to get them all together and make them all feel that they are part of the company, they're part of a family, get them involved, get their families involved. It's a great time to get people to become emotionally involved with the company and what you're doing. And a great time to set the culture that keeps that going as the company grows. So I'll end here. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I'll be very happy to take them.
So Arjun, thank you. That was very insightful. Good to hear about the journey. Couple of points that I took away from your talk. Despite all the planning, there will be some hits and there will be some misses. There will be some mistakes that you will do, and some things will turn into opportunities and stuff. But one of the most important things that I took away from your conversation, at least your perspective, is that when you're reducing costs, try as best as possible not to let go of people. Try to figure out the creative ways in which you can absorb people, and in fact, if your business can absorb it, try and figure out how you can build a stronger team, because there will be a lot more opportunities around that. And I think some creative thinking around that would be useful. But HCL, Headstrong, etc., were fairly large at that point of time to be able to absorb some of these shocks. But I'm sure you would have experienced other friends and other businesses that were not in as strong a position as some of your companies were. There may have been some ways that people handled some of these downturns a little better than some of the other companies. Are there some examples that stand out in the way that you would suggest people behave when their business is really severely hit?
Yeah, so I think, look, ultimately, everyone, if you've recruited good people, which I presume you have, at least most startups should, otherwise they're not going to survive in any case. Most people understand what's going on, right? A lot of them tend to be somewhat selfish. They want to protect themselves, but people understand. So if you're upfront, transparent in your communication with them and make them a part of your problem, don't give them the answers. Tell them these are the options that we have. Which ones do you think work? Which ones don't work? Which ones do you think are best for us? I think that then generates I'm not saying people don't get laid off. They do get laid off,
sure,
but they should get laid off in an environment and a way where they are happy to come back, or they're not unhappy to come back. Let me put it that way. And so you have to create that environment in the organization. It's not that I want to protect myself and I want to let everyone else go. I should take as much pain as everyone else does to try and survive this. Now, I know it's going to be tough for me in a startup because it's like, how do I put it? When we started HCL, I was married, I had a kid. Fortunately, my wife was working, my parents were working. And so my logic was that, look, even if the company fails a year later, I'll get some mud on my face. I think I'm competent enough to get a job. So I'll get a job back and life will go on. It's not that I was going to be on the road, right? I think everyone has to look at their own personal situation and see how they want to handle it. I think this is the time where personal egos and personal image should play no role at all. You should do what's right for the company. You should do what's right for the people in the company. And then you should do what's right for yourself. I think those are the priorities. And as long as you keep those priorities in mind, I think you'll do the right thing. And everyone understands. If you're running really tight on money, it's best to put it to a point where you're just surviving until you can get back to what the market has. If you've got a product that is going to go slow, but you've got technologies or you've got people who can build technologies or services that can go quicker, Get into that. If you've got people who can go build themselves and earn some money instead of working in R&D, talk to them and tell them that's how you got to do it. Everyone has to make some sacrifices at this time. It's a question of what kind of sacrifice and what people are willing to do. There are lots of development R&D people who are not willing to go and talk to customers.
Sure.
And if that's the only option I have for them, there's nothing I can do for them. Because, hello, they may be really great people, but that's not the way a team gets built, and that's not the way I want my company to be going forward. So that's what I would suggest.
So one is, I mean, I hear compassion and clarity of communication and involving the entire team in the decision making, so that it looks, so even if you let go of a person, the relationship does not go away, and you figure out a way in which this becomes at some point of time you can re-engage.
Yeah. You've got to remember, it's a small industry. IT is a small, well, now it's grown a bit, but everyone knows, everyone used to know everyone. So in a small industry, word of mouth impacts your image, lots of things happen. So it's best to, I mean, there'll still be people who'll go to Glassdoor or whatever and say negative things, but that's normal. There's always a percentage that doesn't see things positively. Right. But as long as you're doing the right thing, I think that's the important.
So I'm going to switch tacks a little and ask two related questions. One is the current crisis, unlike some of the others, were the earlier ones, downturns were industry specific. Now this is across the board, and therefore, whether it is going to take a quarter or 2 quarters or a few more quarters, I think it's only a matter of speculation. I don't think anybody has a clear idea onto that front, and that therefore makes decision making and strategic decisions in terms of how to go from here that much more complex. Given early stage companies and startups who may, even if they have a runway for about 12, 15, 18 months, and there is some visibility about path to profitability, should they plan now for the short term and do tactical things that will get them to survival? Or if they feel that there is an opportunity, which most entrepreneurs often do, should still bat for the longer run?
Right now I would think short term. I think right now survival in a way is probably the most important thing. And since you don't know how long this problem is going to last, you've got to find some short term solutions. I'm not saying give up the long term altogether, but try and put that on a slower back burner, try and not spend too much money. It's like, hey, one of the things most companies are doing, and rightly so, is stopping all capital investments. Right. Don't do any capital investment. You got to conserve your cash. You don't know, customers might extend payments. They might say, I'll pay you after 90 days instead of 30 days. 90 might go much longer. So cash has got to be kept, because ultimately it's not P&L or anything. Cash is what dictates your life. Sure. In times like this and normal times too. But that is what you got to do. So stop all capital investments. Try and reduce stuff that consumes cash, other than just what you have to pay, like salaries and stuff. Go talk to your landlords and try and renegotiate your rents. Go, don't say I won't pay. Say, why don't you defer it? They understand this too, and they've got a fixed asset that generates income for them. They don't have to put cost into it. So sure. Try and look at things where people, salaries are, you pay people, then they got to pay to live, to buy food and all that stuff. But they can go to whoever they're renting the house from and say, hey, can I defer 50%, 25% or more? Like the government is doing for EMIs, they're deferring it by 3 months. Try and do that, because those assets, unless they are the only thing that generates income for the landlord and he's dependent on that, then you have a bit of a problem. But those are the thoughts you've got to have. That can I hold payments for my vendors? Are the vendors critical for me? My customers are holding my payments from 30 days to 90 days. Can I make it 30 days to 90 days? Sure. Right? Or can I renegotiate a payment schedule with them that I'll pay whatever I owe them over X months? My customers do that with me all the time when they run into a cash problem. Why can't I do it with my vendors? And so, you got to take actions like that are actually more important right now than actually thinking about what's going to happen 6, 8, 9, 10, 12 months from now.
Sure. Let me ask a more specific question on the strategic shift to a more tactical action for the current one. Let me give you an example. Say, for example, there is a startup that is supplying fresh fruit and vegetables to homes, and suddenly they're, or they were, say, for example, supplying to hotels and restaurants as their strategic focus, and suddenly that business is completely gone. But they have the supply side and they have the logistics, and eventually they want to be big in the hotels and restaurants and horeca chain as the sector as they call it. Would it be okay for them to tactically shift to delivering to households given this current situation, or switching from going away from strategic goals and being tactical is not a wise decision to do irrespective of what the circumstances?
Well, ultimately it has to be specific to the company and etc. But
Of course.
in general, if that was the problem, first thing I would do is have them talk to companies like Zomato and Swiggy and all who are already doing home delivery and see if we can tie up with them to get this done, because they're companies that are actually doing that right now.
Sure.
Second thing is I would look at, not all restaurants have closed down. Some of them are cooking at the back and supplying homes. So I would try and identify those and go to them and try and get aggressive with them in terms of pulling their business, even if my margins are lower, so that I can keep my supply chain going towards some restaurants. And I can then expand on it when things get back to normal. Right. I think those are the two things. Now, if I can't find a Swiggy or Zomato or someone to do my deliveries, which is unlikely, then I would look at, hey, can I do limited deliveries in certain areas where I can take my excess staff and have them do that,
Sure.
some of them at least. Yes, I would look at that as an option if I needed to look at it, but I would see that as a last option if I can't find other people to do it and I can't find other businesses where I can go to. So that's how I would look at it. And I would also look, right now I'm doing only vegetables from the same farmer, same mandi, wherever I'm getting this stuff from. Can I get something else that I can supply which will add to my portfolio in a way without my adding anything to my system, or just use the same truck with its spare capacity or the same person to be able to do that. So you start looking at things that you weren't looking at earlier, or you did not need to look at earlier, to see what can I do here. And yeah, obviously you're going to eat into someone else's lunch, and that's the way it is. It's survival of the fittest. You've got to be one of the fittest.
Sure. On survival of the fittest, in addition to impact on businesses, I'm sure founders and everybody else in the team as well goes through significant emotional and at a personal level turmoil during these kinds of things. Any observations you've had in terms of what is a good way of dealing with some of these challenges at a personal level, at a family level, and some advice that you might give to business leaders and how to come out of this with a little more saner?
Yeah, so don't take it out on your family. I think that's the worst thing you can do, because they don't really understand. They also tense for you in a way, and you need to get your energy out somewhere. Don't take it out in your family. In fact, I would think if you have to take it out, have a session with your executive team and yell at each other, do whatever you need to do. They are the ones that understand. They are the ones that have been with you for a while. Do it with your friends, because they take you for granted in some form, and they understand what you're going through. Ask for advice, talk to people, listen to everyone, do what you think is right. Not all, no one, how do I put it? No one understands your business as well as you do.
Sure.
So when you ask people for advice, they're giving it at a somewhat superficial level because they don't understand your specific business. And so listen to all that and use it by putting your business variables into it and see how it fits in. And the other thing I would say is, exercise, which is good, long walks, and meditate. And, I always tell people and my wife tells me I'm a computer. I always tell people I don't worry about something unless the worry changes the outcome of what I'm worrying about. Right. So if it doesn't change the outcome, why worry about it? Think of solutions, and so
that's a very profound
and your mind is always going through your problems. So what I do when I fly or when I'm on a train or something, I sort of don't sleep. I half sleep. I sleep when I can, but I sort of shut my eyes and I daydream about possible scenarios and what we should do if this happens or that happens. And it's amazing how often that scenario becomes reality at some time, and you've already got a basic game plan in your head because you sort of daydreamt about it. And so I would tell people, think about that. You'll never find a perfect solution, and you'll never be able to perfectly identify the problem as it's going to come up. But if you're close, you at least know where to start, and that's important.
That's a good one. In fact, one of my mentors had many years ago told me about getting clarity about a business. He had told me, see the film in your mind. And I thought that was a very profound piece of advice, because that clarity about, seeing that film in your mind helps you play out various scenarios without any implications in the real world in that
So
sense.
the other thing I wanted to mention was I'm an engineer, so I try to uh, I try to I need metrics that makes me more comfortable. So when I look at a problem and it's got multiple dimensions, I try and put a matrix of importance on each of them. It's impossible to do because every time you put it, something comes up, you want to go back and change. But the very fact of doing that exercise helps you define what are the priorities in those variables and which ones you should look at. I find that very useful. I never come up with the right metrics because I don't think one exists. But at least when you try and put it down, you know which one gets prioritized. And I think that helps me when I look at problems.
And that's what they say about business plans as well, right? Business plans are not an Excel sheet that life will play out according to it, but at least putting that framework in place allows you to get very early warning signs of things that you had thought about not going right in the right direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I still remember, and this is a slight aside, my first job as a management trainee in DCM, the then executive director, Mr. Vinay Bharatram, he wanted to, he was going to get something, and he wanted to show that it's profitable. And so I was doing this, there were no spreadsheets. So I was doing this on paper and putting it together for him, all the math and, stuff like that. And basically what he did, what he wanted was the profitability increased by a slight amount before he gave the final presentation. And so I tweaked something and gave it to him. And after he did all that, he asked me, "What did you do?" I said, "I just reduced the insurance rate by 2 cents per 100 or whatever." I said, "No one even looks at that because it's in the second decimal place, but that changed the number here." You know, and so spreadsheets and business plans are like that. You tell me what you want, I can give it to you.
That's true. But it's a good framework for at least thinking through some of it allows you to put a roadmap together. Last question from my side before we open up for questions from the audience. Private capital markets. I mean, right now, you hear all kinds of things. Some people say, no, there are investors who are willing to look at what they feel are great opportunities at perhaps bargain rates and stuff, while there are other views saying that at least for the next 6 months, forget about any fresh investments coming in. What are you hearing from the market? And for companies that were in the process of or were thinking about raising their rounds at this point of time, how should they be thinking about going forward when they require capital?
Yeah. So for companies who are wanting to raise money, I think this is the wrong time because their valuations get dinged quite considerably. So if you desperately need money, you have no choice. Then you can go out and get it. And a lot of VCs are looking right now. Obviously, the first thing they're doing, I mean, you put yourself in their place. The first thing you do is try and protect your portfolio. See what you can do to make sure that they survive, do well, whatever. Then you look at anything new that you're getting, right? So I think they are looking at something new. They are looking at going in and investing, but they are looking at getting a good deal, a much better deal than what they were getting 2, 3, 4 months ago. And so if you're looking for money right now, if you don't need it, I would say don't take it because you'll get it at a high discount. Therefore, if you're looking for say 5 million, but you think you can survive with one or two, take one or two, and then take the rest later. If I were the VC, I'd like to give you a commitment for all five if I think you've got the right business and the right people, because then I know I'll get a bigger chunk of a nicer company. So you've got to sort of work that out. I think that's basically where it is today. It's different VCs are looking at it differently. They have the money, they have to spend it, they have limited life on their funds. That's how they work. And so it's not that they aren't investing, but they're going to be extra careful. They're going to look for their evaluation criteria will be much more stringent. They're going to look at a team a lot more diligently than they did earlier. They're going to look at the business a lot more diligently. It's going to take you a lot more time and a lot more effort to get less money at a lower valuation. Right? That's where it is right now.
That's the reality of. Are investors likely to alter their thesis on what value creation means in terms of, say, for example, going off after growth at any cost versus trying to see paths to profitability little sooner and stuff? Are some of these, how investors look at what is an investable business and what is a follow-on investment business? Are some of those parameters likely to change or alter? And a related question to this, and if that is, should traditional startups which relied primarily on venture capital should also be looking at alternate ways of fundraising, for example, peer lending platforms and venture debt and some of the other models that were traditionally available?
Yeah, they should, according to me. And in fact, they should always look at that because you dilute less. So why they shouldn't look at it is beyond me. I mean, if I could get debt, and that's how we grew HCL. We had no VCs at that time. So we grew on basically debt from the banks. The banks were our VCs without realizing they were VCs, right? And they did it only for interest, which was high. It was 18% or something, 15%, 18% in those days. But yes, that is the way we grew. And that's one reason why some of the old companies like Wipro and HCL, the founders have a large chunk of the company because they didn't really give it to VCs. They bootstrapped it for a long time. And I can tell you, I don't advise people to do it like we did it in HCL, but for 20 years, if 60% of your time is spent worrying about cash flow, it's not a good place to be, from a blood pressure tension point of view. And so I don't know if I'd advise people to look at it that way. But yeah, that's, I think, getting back to the question that you asked, I think ultimately that's what you've got to do. You've just got to make sure, that it's there the way you want it.
Thank you very much, Arjun. I think this is very insightful. I'm not sure if we've got a few questions. Let me just give me a minute as I read it. Somebody who's asking that if your business is not currently generating revenue and losing out of, and you're running out of your runway, should you maintain status quo or should you go into what he calls mild dormancy, which I suspect meaning suspending operations for a while?
Yeah, so I would say if you're not generating revenue at all and you have no chance of generating revenue, then I would suggest you go into that mild dormancy that you talk about. I would assume that either you're in development stage, which is one end of it, or you're in a proof of concept stage where you're not generating revenue. Yes, you'll decide the cash you have, the people you have. Can I do some more proof of concepts so that when market comes back, I'll have, instead of one or two, I'll have 5 or 7 people who are ready to buy, out of which not all are going to give me an order, but I'll have a higher chance that at least 3 or 4 or 1 or 2 of them will give me an order. So that's a decision you've got to take based on what your cash is, where you are in this situation. And very difficult for me to give an answer at a high level, but you have to look at your individual business and take that decision.
There is one question that has been raised, which again, in our conversations with several of our portfolio companies has been a niggling problem, which is collections, especially from large enterprises. And there have been situations where companies said, look, we're willing to pay, but we did not have a online payment mechanism till now. It was about 2 people signing a check. So even if I want to pay, I don't have a way of paying it. And yet there are some companies that are saying that, look, everything is on hold right now. We don't know when we'll be able to pay you. Especially when you're dealing with large enterprise clients or mid-sized companies, are there any learnings in terms of how to handle that best? And a related question onto that, in the circumstances where your clients are also going through some kind of pain, for companies that are doing enterprise sales, what are the kind of ways in which you maintain your client relationships in some form or fashion?
So yeah, let me do the first one first and then come to the second question. Right. So when people are not paying, I think there are two things, especially large companies. One is obviously you got to go and get emotional, like you do with government departments to get your payments out. Right. Whether you, I don't know, I can, all the drama, whether you cry, I'll be on the road, whatever. You got to do that drama and appeal to their emotion to get that thing going, get that money out. Uh, we have that problem today because of the lockdown. A lot of people said they mailed the checks. I don't know where the checks are. I can't go and collect them. But yeah, that is a problem because people who don't have online, and so to go, how do you tell them, give me another check? Where do they give it? But the mail may not be working. So yes, that's an issue. The other nice thing about large companies is if you have a good relationship with your bank manager, go to them and say, why don't you discount this for me? This company is not going to go down, but they are saying, give me time to pay, right? Can I get 50%, 60%, 40% against that, right? There's a chance they might listen, especially in today's environment where they're supposed to be a little more amenable to stuff like this, right? I guess those are the things you've got to do. There's nothing else that's going to work. Large companies have the money. Most of them will not, if you go tell them this is going to be done, you threaten bad publicity if they get to a point where they're not going to pay, and you say, I'm going to go to the press and say because of this, blah, blah, blah. They've cleared everything and it's sitting there. It may screw up your relationship with them, but that's a decision you got to take of how you want to handle that. I think. The other question I didn't answer was VCs going after will want a path to profitability, or they'll be willing to take losses going forward. I think there are two things. To me, I can't understand why anyone wants valuation of companies without some path to profitability, right? In fact, I don't feel comfortable if I'm advising a company that then show me a path to profitability. Might take 5 years, might take 7 years, but at least show me that path, right? I think what has happened, a lot of companies, a lot of VCs have made money by different rounds of funding at higher rates for companies that are making a loss, right? I don't know what's going to happen at WeWork, but that's a classic example of what could happen if you don't have a path to profitability. Right. And I'm not sure how many companies, how many VCs are going to keep following that route. They do it today. They may even continue to do it. But if I was advising a VC, I would want to see that path to profitability. I would like the growth is important. It's not that it's not important, but you can't only grow. You have to be profitable. If I could, it's very much like that. I read it somewhere about this guy, software engineer in Bangalore, who was shifting homes, and he wanted to shift his bed, but the cost of trucking was high. So he went to Quicker on one ID and sold it, and went to Quicker on another ID and bought it, and they delivered it free. So, right? So I don't want to be a VC who's funding that kind of stuff.
It's an interesting one. By the way, you mentioned about bill discounting in the Loomis Supply Chain Labs portfolio. We have two companies that are working on platforms that help in bill discounting. One is a company called Razorfin and the other company called Expedite. So some of these companies would actually benefit from the current environment. There's a question that has been asked. I'm going to frame that question slightly differently, which is, in the current situation where everything is in a flux, do you think the smaller guys have an advantage over some of the larger players who may not be able to be as nimble and as flexible as some of the smaller guys? Or would that eventually be an advantage for the larger players?
I think the smaller guys have an advantage of agility. And I mentioned that in our Morgan Stanley. I mean, while we were 60 odd million, we were small compared to Capgemini and TCS, right? So you compare $1 billion companies with a less than $100 million company, we are small. And for someone like Morgan Stanley, we were really small. But if you're talking of startups, what you got to make sure is that you overcome the worry that they have about you being a startup. And in a way, I've got to say that we learned that very early in the computer industry, because the big gorilla in the room was IBM. And IBM's strategy of sales was called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That if you bought from anyone other than IBM, your boss might fire you, something goes wrong, uncertainty and doubt, are you doing the right thing? So FUD was standard. That was what they used, and rightly so from their point of view. So we had to fight against FUD every time we tried to sell computers. And that's really what smaller companies have to do. They have to fight that in people's minds. They have to make sure that they take the FUD out from their customers' minds, and that the customer really wants to go with them. Right. I think that's the way you got to do it. It sort of was ingrained in us in the computer industry, thanks to IBM. But I'm sure there are lots of industries with the big gorillas who do the same thing when they sell.
Sure. I'm going to end with one last question. In these tough, challenging circumstances, where entrepreneurs are by and large very positive, optimistic, future forward-looking, sort of people, it's tough to maintain that the sense of positivity and stuff. How should entrepreneurs respond? Should they be on their optimistic self, or should they reassess their optimism with talking to people? Should you listen to outside voices, or should you listen to your gut and still move forward from here? Because you see a lot of questions that get asked. I sense that a lot of founders typically think of this in a 3 minute ke baad sab theek ho jayega. I don't know whether that will happen or not. And how do you continue to be optimistic and realistic, yet at the same time be cognizant of whatever is happening?
So I think you defined it right. Most people are optimistic by nature. They want to change the world. That's why they became entrepreneurs in the first place. I think you've got to tone that down a little bit and be realistically optimistic. Now, that's a difficult definition, but it's your gut that got you here. It's your gut that will get you up. Please listen to everyone, because you don't know what's going on, and then take a decision. It's like, when my wife asked me what I thought of the economy during some slight ups and downs, and I used to tell her, I think it's going to do well, I think it's not doing well. And she said, how do you know? You're not an economist. I said, no, I go at the same time to office in California when I was there at Sunnyvale every morning. And I look at the number of cars at the light that are in front of me. And if the number is down, I know things are slowing down. And if the number is up, I know things are doing well. It's just stupid things like that that give you your gut. So I don't know what gives people their gut. But ultimately, in some ways, that's what you end up sort of looking at. So when we were doing, for example, foreign exchange buffering, I have a nephew who now works with ICICI Bank, who used to send this foreign exchange stuff. And I thought he's a smart guy, so I would listen to what he is doing rather than all the other experts. And I'd be telling my people that that's what I think. And after a while, they've come to me and said, "Hey, how do you know?" So I don't know. I'm not that I'm doing it. I'm just listening to what he sends me, and I sort of put a little of my rationalization on it and said, "This is where I think it's going to go." It's like when we were making the budget this year in 31st March. In early March, they said, they were doing 71 to a dollar. I said, no, do it at 74. They said, you crazy, blah, blah. I said, just do it at 74. And at the end of the month, we look at it. And if it's too different, we'll change it. It's just a number in a spreadsheet that you got to change. And now everyone thinks that I had a vision that it was going to jump beyond 74. It wasn't. It was just that you got to look at the trend. You've been in it for so long. I mean, your gut tells you something's going to happen. You've depended on, as an entrepreneur, you've depended on it for so long. It's been wrong at times, but hello, if it's right more often than it's wrong, a lot more often than it's wrong, then you go by gut. It's like how you recruit. Everything is good and fine. You still go by gut. It's exactly that way. Will this guy fit in with the culture of my company?
Sure.
And that's a gut decision that you got to take. No HR, no one's. They'll give you 101 tests that tell you different things. But ultimately, that's what's going to happen. So, that's what I would do. I would think, hey, don't give up yourself. You've done it. You're the person, right or wrong, successful or not successful. Ultimately, you are the person who's got to take that decision. If that's the way it is, then that's the way you want to go.
Arjun, thank you very much for your time. This was very, very insightful. A couple of things that I've, noted and taken note of myself. But I think the one thing that I would, always want to remember is be compassionate when you're dealing with people in a crisis. As best as possible, try and see how you don't have to let go of people, and even if you have to rationalize cost on the people front, figure out a way in which it is least painful for everyone, and make adjustments for people who may not have the ability to absorb these shocks in some way or the other, and try to be creative in a way in which you will be able to do that. What I also hear from you is that it's okay to be opportunistic at some point of time, even if that deviates a little from your strategic or a long-term strategic thing. Focus on survival and trying to get better cash flows in the short term. Talk to customers, talk to everyone around, make it a collaborative effort, and do whatever it takes to survive and grow as a business. Some things sometimes will be tough, but overall, I think in the long term, everything works out well.
And just one last piece of advice before I go off. Ultimately, successful companies are run by people who are motivated. If you can't motivate your people, it's going to be very difficult to make a company successful. So, you when you start, you're managing technology, you're managing something. As the company grows, ultimately you're managing people. You're motivating them to do right. You're making sure that they go that extra mile, happily go that extra mile. And so, I always say this: if you manage people, if you can manage people well, you'll always be successful. And for growth, at least, to me, that's the most important thing. And so I just wanted to leave that last piece of advice. Also, if people want to ask some questions on email or whatever, do give them an email that they can forward to me, or you can give my email to them. And I'd be quite happy to, if I get swamped, it'll take a little time, but I'd be quite happy to try and get back to them.
Wonderful. Indeed, Arjun, there are a bunch of questions that are specific to specific companies. That's why I didn't take it up in the Q&A. But, all the participants, whether you put your question or no, if you have company-specific questions as well, do send it to the Supply Chain Labs team, and we'll be happy to address it whatever we can at our end. And wherever required, we will request Arjun's interventions on these questions and inputs on these questions as well. So everyone have a great day. Be safe. Be happy. And Arjun, thank you very, very much for this very insightful session.
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being there.
Ashutosh, would you like to end with any comments or summary from your side?
No, Prajakt, we are all good. I would just like to thank Arjun for this very, very insightful session, and urge all the participants to be on the lookout for, as Prajakt said, for future webinars where we will be covering certain very, very pertinent topics around what you guys are facing day in and day out. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.